So a lot of people ask me if I like to swirl or stir my pour over coffees. Well, technically, if you've watched my other videos, I only stir. But let me explain to you my understanding between the swirl and the stir and why I only use the stir. Now, if you guys are new here, my name is Vincent and I'm the head roaster for Tales Coffee. And if you love educational and experimental videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can get the latest updates on my newest techniques. Let's start with the swirl and understanding it a little bit more. Now the swirl is when you kind of pick up the dripper and you kind of give it a swirl. Doesn't matter what kind of dripper it is, you just lift it and you do this rotational movement. Now the idea is for the water or you to move the grounds around, saturate it, or just kind of do a flush. So there's like two main key parts to the swirl itself. It's how strong you lift it or kind of swirl it, and then how hard you kind of put it back down. Now the swirl itself is kind of tricky because there's a lot of components to it. When you swirl, you're actually moving the water, but the floating stuff kind of floats and the stuff on the bottom doesn't really agitate either. But the worst part in my opinion is when you put it down, no matter how gentle you are, it's gonna send a little bit of a shock wave upwards. And when the shock wave kind of hits the grounds, the stuff that floats doesn't actually get hit with a lot of shock wave, but the stuff in the middle actually feels it tremendously. And so a lot of the grounds actually sink a lot faster, but if it's floating, it just stays afloat. So there's gonna be quite a bit of a difference between the separation of the top and the bottom kind of grounds, which means the agitation necessary is going to be a lot. You're going to want to agitate a lot more in the top for you to extract a lot more of the flavors. I'm going to show you guys a quick experiment. We've got ourselves a beaker just so we can see a little bit more clearly. We've got some grounds. I've said this before, but when we brew coffees, the pour itself does most of the agitation. And so I'm just going to pour some hot water into here, and I'm going to try to agitate it as much as possible. We're just going to roughly hit what we think is necessary. So when we pour, you can still see that there are still some dry grounds, and I'm going to try and break that up just by turning it around. So here we have kind of the beaker filled with coffee in it. You can see some clumping at the bottom and it's moving up. But yeah, you get this thing, and the swirl itself is kind of like when you go like this. Now obviously you're going to be doing this with a pour over device. It could be a flat bottom, it could be a normal one, but you're gonna be doing that kind of a swirl. Now the swirl itself puts a little bit of agitation on it and you can lift it pretty high. But if you give it a swirl, you'll see that there are grounds floating up, but the act of kind of putting it down breaks it up, and now a lot of the grounds that are moving in the middle are actually just sinking rather quickly. I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but you guys can definitely run this experiment yourself. But a lot of the times when we put it down, no matter how gentle we are, we're gonna have that kind of little motion. And this little motion is kind of like a tap. The tap itself makes what's floating in the middle sink faster, but what's floating stay afloat. So if we want to have less sinking, try to put it down as gently as you possibly can. I know there are some that have almost mastered the technique, or if, like me, I use the metal V60 and it's got a silicone base, and so the movement would be a little bit absorbed, so it doesn't have as much. But for those that are using maybe like a plastic or a ceramic dripper, the tap could feel a little bit more substantial. So yeah, when the grounds have sank, as you guys can see, the floating stuff has just stayed afloat, and the stuff that has sank will just completely sink. And the problem with this kind of agitation, in my opinion, is we're gonna have the stuff at the top staying afloat. And when the water passes through, it's just going to be passing through what's at the bottom a little bit more, which causes this to get extracted a little bit more than what's up here. And because of the shock wave that has been going up, and because of more of the grounds that it's in the middle sinking, we're gonna have a little bit of a higher extraction down towards the bottom. So this brings us into how we use the swirl. Now there are actually two optimal times that I believe is the best timing to use a swirl. The first is when and if you do a bloom. Now for those of you that know, I don't tend to do blooms, but if you do a bloom, this actually might be a good time because all the grounds are still floating and it hasn't really been agitated enough for it to fully sink. So if you do a swirl and the tap happens, it'll still stay floating. And now the other time that it's best to use it is actually at the end when the grounds are towards the end and you're like using a little bit of a coarser grind. You want the grounds to be a little bit more agitated, a little bit more extracted. You can lift it up, give it a swirl, make sure all the fines have been pulled down, and you can give that a tap. And that's when it really, really sinks down and just causes a lot more of a slower final drawdown time. Now, I just spoke about how the fines get pulled down. When we do swirls, a lot of the coffees that's on the walls of the filter paper, whether it's a flat bottom or a pour-over, actually gets kind of swept down. It's similar to how I like to do a flush pour. Flush pours when I kind of flush everything down from the sides. It pulls all the grinds off the wall and it goes down to the middle. There are goods and bads to it. The good part is you're gonna get fully extracting everything. The bad part is you tend to be flushing down a bit more of the fines. And when that happens and you pull all the fines down, you tend to have a lot more clogging happening. And clogging causes the microfines to be over extracting, whereas your boulders tend to not have as much of that. Less extraction. So we're gonna have a little bit more of an imbalanced flavor. That is why I don't personally like to swirl. I don't like to see the clogging. It increases the drawdown time, and I don't have a good reason per se as to why I would use it. So let's get into the stir and talk about why I like to stir. Before we move on to stirring, if you guys don't like swirling, hit the thumbs up. And if you do like swirling, please let me know in the comments what I should change about my thought process and what I should be testing to make the swirling experience better. So stirring is when you take a stir stick or chopstick, like me, and you give it a stir during your pour over brews, or yeah, anytime. Now, when we stir, there's actually two main times I like to stir. One is right after the bloom, and one is right when I finish pouring all the water. Now, for me, stirring is a lot more controlled than a swirl. A stir tends to create more agitation, but I think it's controlled because no matter how much you stir, it has a different purpose or meaning behind it. Now, if you were to stir behind the bloom or after the bloom, you stir with the intent of making sure all your grounds are wet. So once you finish kind of pouring, you want to give it a quick stir like that, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to feel out where all the clumping is, break it all up, make sure the water has enough time to kind of just go through, and that's the idea behind the stir after the bloom. And if you're going to be stirring after the pour itself, you're looking to kind of just extract the last little bit of flavors left that you didn't extract from the pour itself. It's kind of like dunking a tea bag and then squeezing it at the end. I don't know. I like to squeeze my tea bags at the end. It's kind of weird. I just put it against the lid and just like press it, right? That's how you draw all the last little bit of flavors. And for me, that's the idea behind the stirring. For that, you want to get a nice little flow going, and the faster you stir, the more the microfines actually hit the sides and stay there. The microfines don't want to be extracted as long just because they tend to have a more bitterness or like over extraction happening to them. So when you stir vigorously and have a high speed to the stir, you're actually going to be able to get rid of those fines and have a nice unclogged extraction that is very well extracted. So that is why I like to stir, and that is how I like to stir. So from a lot of videos that I watch with people swirling, I see them do it after the bloom to kind of just get all the stuff going. A good example is James Hoffmann. I think it's very satisfying to watch it, but I don't personally see a very good reason as to why I would use it. I know when he does it, he had the, it was like his dripper was kind of put together, so it's easier to swirl a little bit more. But I personally don't see why we would need to swirl. I think, like I said, the putting down of it causes a lot of movement in the lower side of the dripper, which causes a lot of the stuff to just sink. And then the draining time on that would cause a lot of over extraction in the bottom part of the dripper, I guess. And then what's floating on top kind of just stays floating, and you're just not gonna get enough agitation there, so you're not extracting any flavors. So I personally don't really see too much of a reason as to why I would swirl. And so that's why I think the clear winner for me is the stir itself. Now, the act of actually tapping the dripper is actually pretty interesting. I do want to do a quick little touch up on this. When you tap, you actually release a lot of like the pressure between the grinds or the grounds. So you can actually tap after you're finished brewing. So when we have a dome or if we have a flatbed, there's actually a lot of moisture that's trapped in the middle. The act of tapping and lifting it kind of just gives it a little bit of breathing room and more of the liquids will drain out. That's how you can actually use the tap to your advantage to just draw out maybe the last little bit of flavor. It really isn't necessary. Sometimes I do it just because I just feel good about it, but yeah, it's not necessary. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys like to stir, thumbs up please. And if you guys can change my mind on why I should use a swirl, please leave it in the comments below. If you guys have any questions about anything, also let me know in the comments. I'd love to help you guys clarify or maybe even make a new video on that. So yeah, let me know down there. Thanks for watching and happy brewing. Bye guys.